The janitor's burden. Mason Carter's hands were calloused, his knuckles raw from years of scrubbing floors and wiping away the careless footprints of those who didn't see him. His uniform, once a deep navy blue, had faded into a dull, worn-out shade, clinging to his lean frame. The sharp scent of industrial cleaner filled his nostrils as he pushed his mop across the pristine marble floor of Holloway Enterprises, the largest corporate empire in the city. The rhythmic back-and-forth motion was soothing in a way. It gave him time to think, about bills piling up, about the extra shift he'd need to take to cover Ava's school supplies, about the life he once dreamed of before it all fell apart. Click. Clack. Click. The sharp sounds of expensive heels echoed against the polished surface as executives breezed past him, their designer suits crisp, their perfumes heavy in the air. No one met his eyes. No one acknowledged his existence. He was a shadow, a man meant to be unseen. It had been years since Mason stopped expecting kindness from this world. The weight of the past. Ava's laughter echoed in his mind, a sound that reminded him why he kept going. His 5-year-old daughter was his world, the only piece of happiness he had left. But raising her alone hadn't been easy. The loss of Camila, Ava's mother, had broken him. He had met her when they were both just kids, growing up on opposite sides of the city. She had been born into wealth, the daughter of a powerful businessman, Benjamin Holloway, the same man whose name was etched in gold at the front of the building Mason now cleaned for minimum wage. Camila had loved him despite their differences. And Mason? He had loved her with every part of his soul. But love hadn't been enough to keep them together. Her family had ripped them apart. He could still hear Benjamin's cold voice the last time they had spoken. "You'll never be good enough for her. You're a nobody. Stay away." And then, just months later, Camila was gone. Complications during childbirth. Mason had held Ava in his arms, numb and hollow, swearing he'd never let her suffer the way he had. He had never gone back to the Holloway family. He hadn't wanted their money, their pity, or their power. All he had needed was Ava. A sudden interruption. "Excuse me." A sharp voice cut through Mason's thoughts. He looked up to see a woman in a sleek, tailored suit standing impatiently in front of him. She was in her late 30s, her dark hair pulled into a perfect bun, her eyes filled with irritation as she glanced at his mop bucket, blocking her way. Without a word, Mason pulled it aside, his face burning. She stepped past him, her expensive perfume lingering in the air as if she were trying to erase the mere scent of his presence. He exhaled slowly and went back to his work, biting back the frustration that bubbled in his chest. He couldn't afford to get angry. Not here. Not when he had a little girl waiting for him at home. Ava's bright smile. By the time Mason finished, his muscles ached, and his fingers were stiff from gripping the mop handle all day. He checked his watch, 6 p.m. He needed to hurry. After clocking out, he made his way through the dimly lit streets to Mrs. Jenkins' house. She was an elderly widow who lived in their small apartment complex, always eager to watch Ava while Mason worked late shifts. When he arrived, Ava was already waiting on the porch, her tiny backpack slung over her shoulders. Her curly brown hair bounced as she ran toward him, her arms flung wide. "Daddy!" Mason knelt and caught her in his arms, lifting her effortlessly. The exhaustion melted away the moment she wrapped her little arms around his neck. "Did you have fun with Mrs. Jenkins today?" he asked, kissing her forehead. "She let me help her bake cookies." Ava grinned, her big brown eyes gleaming with excitement. "I saved you one." Mason chuckled, his heart swelling with love. "You're the best, baby girl." She nodded seriously, then pulled back slightly. "Daddy, can I come to work with you tomorrow?" Mason stiffened. "Sweetheart, my work isn't fun. But I want to see where you go," she insisted. "I promise I'll be quiet." He sighed, rubbing his forehead. Tomorrow was going to be tough. Mrs. Jenkins had a doctor's appointment, and he had no one else to watch Ava. He had been planning to ask his boss for just a few hours off, but deep down, he knew the answer would be no. He had no choice. Okay, he finally said. But you have to listen to everything I say. Ava clapped her hands, beaming. Yay! I promise, Daddy. As Mason carried her home, a strange feeling settled in his gut. If only he knew how much their lives were about to change. A simple request. Mason woke up before the sun rose, as he did every day. His body ached from the previous night's work, but he was used to the exhaustion. It had become a constant companion over the years. He stretched his stiff limbs and turned toward the small bed where Ava was still curled up beneath a faded pink blanket, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. For a moment, Mason simply watched her. She was so peaceful in sleep, her tiny fingers gripping the corner of her stuffed bunny, the same one Camila had bought when she was still pregnant. Mason swallowed hard, pushing the memory away before it could consume him. Today was going to be different. He had never brought Ava to work before. He never wanted her to see that side of his life, the side where people looked at him as if he was invisible, the side where no one saw his worth. But he had no choice. The morning hustle. Careful not to wake her, Mason moved quietly to the tiny kitchenette in their one-bedroom apartment. He pulled open the fridge and frowned. Half a carton of milk. A few slices of bread. Some leftover soup from 2 nights ago. Money was tight, tighter than ever. He had barely managed to pay rent last month, and Ava's growing appetite made it harder to stretch what little they had. He poured some milk into a cup and set it on the table before grabbing a slice of bread. It wasn't much of a breakfast, but Ava never complained. By the time he turned around, she was awake, rubbing her sleepy eyes and stretching her tiny arms. "Good morning, Daddy," she mumbled through a yawn. Mason smiled and crouched beside her bed. "Good morning, Princess. Ready for your big day?" Her face lit up with excitement. "I get to go to work with you." He chuckled, smoothing out her messy curls. "That's right. But remember our deal? You have to be extra quiet and stay close to me the whole time." "I promise," she said, hopping out of bed. Mason helped her get dressed in her favorite blue dress, the one with the little white stars. It was a little too small for her now, but she loved it too much to give it up. "Can we bring Bunny too?" Ava asked, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Mason hesitated. He didn't want anything to draw attention to her, but he also knew how much Bunny meant to her. "All right," he said. "But Bunny has to follow the rules too." Ava nodded solemnly. "Bunny promises." A father's worry. The walk to work was longer than usual with Ava's tiny legs trying to keep up. She chattered about everything, pointing out the birds, the passing cars, even the cracks in the sidewalk. Mason listened, but his mind was elsewhere. What if his boss found out? What if someone complained about a child being in the building? What if? No. He couldn't afford to think that way. He just had to keep her hidden. By the time they reached the towering glass building of Holloway Enterprises, Mason's nerves were on edge. He crouched in front of Ava, holding her tiny hands in his rough ones. "Remember what we talked about?" he asked softly. Ava nodded eagerly. "Be quiet. Stay close. Don't touch anything." "That's my girl," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. The grand lobby was already busy, filled with people in tailored suits and polished shoes. Mason's presence, as always, went unnoticed. But Ava's wide eyes took in everything, the chandeliers, the sleek desks, the massive glass walls that stretched toward the sky. "Daddy, this place is huge," she whispered in awe. Mason tightened his grip on her hand. "I know, baby. But we have to hurry, okay? He led her toward the janitor's supply room, tucked away in a quiet hallway near the back of the lobby. It was a small space, cluttered with mops, cleaning solutions, and stacks of paper towels. Mason set Ava on an empty stool. "You stay right here," he instructed. "I'll be right outside." Ava nodded, hugging Bunny to her chest. Mason let out a breath and grabbed his mop. So far, so good. A child's curiosity. At first, Ava did exactly as she was told. She swung her legs back and forth, humming quietly to herself. But soon, the curiosity bubbling inside her grew too strong. She peeked out the doorway, watching as her father mopped the floors, his expression focused and serious. She didn't understand why people ignored him. Didn't they see how hard he was working? Her gaze drifted toward the reception desk, where a tall man in a sleek navy suit stood, speaking to one of the assistants. Ava tilted her head. There was something familiar about him. Her tiny fingers clutched the doorframe as she stepped out just a little more, her eyes never leaving the man's face. And then, suddenly, it hit her. Her heart leaped. "Daddy," she called out. But she wasn't looking at Mason. She was staring at the man in the navy suit. The entire lobby went silent. Mason's blood ran cold. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Ava was pointing straight at the CEO of Holloway Enterprises. The powerful man who owned the very floors Mason cleaned. The man who had once ripped Camila away from him. Benjamin Holloway. And Benjamin was staring back at her like he had seen a ghost. A stunned whisper passed through the air. "She looks just like Camila." Mason's stomach dropped. He reached for Ava, but it was too late. The buried past had just exploded into the present. And nothing would ever be the same, the ghost of the past. The silence in the grand lobby of Holloway Enterprises was deafening. Ava's small voice had shattered the routine of the office, and now, every pair of eyes was fixated on the child who had unknowingly cracked open a past long buried. Mason felt his heart thunder against his ribcage as he scooped Ava into his arms, pulling her close in a desperate attempt to shield her. His fingers trembled slightly as they curled protectively around her tiny frame. But it was too late. Benjamin Holloway, the powerful CEO, stood frozen, his face pale and unreadable. His normally sharp, calculating eyes were now wide with shock, his entire body rigid as if struck by lightning. Mason could see it, the recognition, the disbelief, the memory of a woman they had both loved flickering in Benjamin's gaze. It was the way he stared at Ava. As if he were seeing Camila again. A hushed whisper spread through the employees gathered in the lobby. Did she just call him Daddy? Wait, who is she? She looks just like. One of Benjamin's assistants, a woman in a sleek charcoal suit, leaned in and whispered urgently into his ear. Mason couldn't hear her words, but he knew what she was saying. She looks just like Camila. The weight of the moment. Mason swallowed the lump in his throat and forced himself to move. His priority was Ava. Tightening his hold on his daughter, he turned sharply on his heel, ready to disappear into the service hallway, to run before Benjamin could regain his voice and demand answers. But he didn't make it 2 steps before a commanding voice rang through the air. Mason. Mason stopped dead in his tracks. The way Benjamin said his name sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't just recognition. It was something deeper. A question. A demand. Slowly, Mason turned, locking eyes with the man who had once ordered him to stay away from Camila. Benjamin took a step forward. Who is that girl? His voice was sharp, but there was something else hidden beneath it, something raw. Mason's jaw clenched. He didn't owe this man an explanation. Not after what he had done. He adjusted his grip on Ava, who clung to his shirt, confused by the sudden tension in the air. "She's my daughter," Mason said, his voice firm. "That's all you need to know." A flicker of something flashed across Benjamin's face. Anger? Pain? Regret? Mason couldn't tell. Then Benjamin's eyes dropped to Ava, taking in every detail. The dark curls, the soft round cheeks, the bright, inquisitive brown eyes. Eyes that mirrored his daughter's. Camilla's eyes. For the first time in years, Benjamin Holloway looked shaken. A father's fear. Mason had spent years preparing himself for this moment, the day when Camilla's family might come looking, when the truth he had worked so hard to protect would finally catch up to him. But it wasn't supposed to happen like this. Ava wasn't supposed to be here. He had fought so hard to keep her away from this world, from the power-hungry, ruthless empire that had deemed him unworthy. And now, with just one innocent word, his daughter had unknowingly placed herself right in the center of a storm. A storm Mason wasn't sure he could stop. His grip tightened on her as he turned toward the service hallway again. "I need to get back to work." Benjamin's voice came again, firm, unwavering. "Not yet." Mason stiffened. The words weren't a request. They were a command. The employees watching the scene unfold seemed to sense the shift in power. Some exchanged glances, while others pretended to be busy, not daring to interfere. Mason turned back slowly, his eyes narrowing. He had spent years scraping by, enduring the looks of pity and judgment, pushing himself to the breaking point just to provide for Ava. And now, the man responsible for all of it was standing in front of him, demanding answers. Mason lifted his chin. "No offense, Mr. Holloway, but you don't get to tell me what to do anymore," he said evenly. "Not after everything." Benjamin's jaw tightened, his sharp features hardening into an unreadable mask. But Mason wasn't finished. "You made it very clear years ago that I was nothing," Mason continued. "That I would never be good enough for your daughter." His voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. "Well, she's gone now. And I don't owe you a damn thing." A few employees gasped softly, their eyes darting between the janitor and the CEO. No one ever spoke to Benjamin Holloway like that. But Benjamin didn't fire back with anger. He didn't speak at all. He simply stared at Ava. As if trying to piece together something impossible. As if the truth had only just now hit him. The unspoken truth. "Camilla never told you, did she?" Mason's entire body went rigid at the question. Benjamin's voice was lower now, more controlled, but there was something beneath it, something almost pained. Mason felt his hands begin to tremble. "Told me what?" Benjamin took a slow step forward, his gaze still locked onto Ava as if the very sight of her was unraveling something inside him. Then, he spoke. "Camilla never told you about the deal she made with me." Mason's breath caught in his throat. "What deal?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Benjamin's expression flickered with something unreadable before he finally answered. "She agreed to leave you, to cut you out of her life, in exchange for protection." The world seemed to tilt. Mason's fingers clenched into fists. "You're lying." "I have no reason to," Benjamin said quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Mason shook his head. This didn't make sense. Camilla had loved him. She had fought for them. She would never. Would she? His mind reeled back to the months before Ava was born. Camilla had grown distant, withdrawn. She had stopped answering his calls. And then, one day, she was gone. He had thought it was her choice. But what if it hadn't been? His pulse pounded in his ears. What kind of protection? Benjamin's expression darkened. From people more dangerous than me. A sudden weight settled in Mason's chest. There was something he had never understood about Camilla's disappearance. Something that had never quite made sense. But before Mason could press further, Benjamin spoke again. I want a DNA test. Mason's blood ran cold. No, his voice was sharp, unyielding. Benjamin's gaze didn't waver. If she's my granddaughter, I deserve to know. Mason's hands curled into fists. She's mine. That's all you need to know. Benjamin exhaled slowly. I'm not going to take her from you. Mason didn't believe that for a second. He had seen what wealth and power could do. He had seen what this man was capable of. And now, everything he had fought to protect was teetering on the edge of collapse. Ava, still clinging to him, looked up in confusion. Daddy, she whispered. Mason took a step back. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But one thing was clear, nothing would ever be the same again. A battle of blood and secrets. The world felt like it had slowed to a crawl. Mason stood frozen in the grand lobby of Holloway Enterprises, his arms wrapped protectively around Ava, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The weight of Benjamin Holloway's demand, I want a DNA test, hung between them like an unspoken threat. Every muscle in Mason's body was coiled tight, his instinct screaming at him to run. To protect Ava. To take her far away from this place, from this man who had the power to strip her from his life. But he knew, deep down, that running wouldn't make this go away. Benjamin wasn't just a wealthy CEO. He was a man who always got what he wanted. And if he truly believed Ava was his granddaughter, he wouldn't stop until he had proof. Ava's innocence. Ava, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air, tugged at Mason's sleeve, her big brown eyes full of innocent curiosity. Daddy, why is that man looking at me like that? Mason swallowed hard, forcing a small, strained smile. It's nothing, baby. Let's get out of here. But as he turned to leave, Benjamin's voice came again, calm, measured, but holding an authority that Mason hated. Mason. Mason didn't stop. He didn't trust himself to. Ava's safety came first. But Benjamin wasn't done. If you walk out that door, I will find out the truth, he said. And I won't be as patient next time. The words hit Mason like a gut punch. He stopped mid-step, his jaw tightening. A muscle in his neck twitched as he slowly turned back. Benjamin wasn't making an empty threat. Mason had seen firsthand what power could do. If Benjamin really wanted to dig into his life, into Ava's past, into every piece of information he had tried to bury, he could. Mason's eyes burned with fury. You think you can just order a test and take her from me? His voice was low, dangerous. Benjamin's expression didn't change. I didn't say that. Mason's hands clenched into fists. That's what people like you do, though, right? You throw your money and your lawyers at a problem until it disappears? His voice trembled with restrained rage. I won't let you turn my daughter into a problem you can fix. Benjamin took a slow step forward. His presence loomed over Mason, a stark contrast between the two men, one in an expensive suit, polished and powerful, the other in a janitor's uniform, tired and desperate. I'm not trying to take her, Benjamin said, his voice quieter now. I just need to know the truth. Mason shook his head, his breath coming hard and fast. I already know the truth. His voice was thick with emotion. She's my daughter. She's mine. And she doesn't need you. The past unraveled. Benjamin's jaw tightened. That's not for you to decide alone. Mason let out a bitter laugh. That's rich, coming from you. You decided a long time ago that I wasn't good enough. That Camila and I didn't belong together. So don't stand there pretending like you suddenly care about my family now. Benjamin's expression darkened. Camila made a choice, he said evenly. She left you. Mason flinched. The words hurt more than they should have. Because for the longest time, he had believed them. He had convinced himself that Camila had simply walked away. That she had chosen wealth and comfort over love. But now? Now, Benjamin was hinting at something deeper, something Mason had never known. His hands curled into fists. "You're lying." Benjamin's gaze remained steady. "She did it to protect you." The breath caught in Mason's throat. Benjamin continued, his voice strangely softer now. "You think I wanted to break you two apart?" His eyes flickered with something unreadable. "You think I enjoyed watching my daughter suffer?" Mason's throat tightened. Because Benjamin wasn't just saying these things out of manipulation. There was something real in his voice. Something painful. Mason's fingers twitched as a memory surfaced. Camila, months before she left, looking pale, exhausted, scared. Had she really left him by choice? Had she really abandoned him? Or had she been forced? Ava's questions. Ava, still holding tightly to Mason's uniform, looked between the two men, her young mind sensing the tension. "Daddy." Her tiny fingers tugged at his sleeve. "Who is he?" Mason's chest ached. He didn't want her to know. Not yet. Not like this. But before he could answer, Benjamin took a breath and did something Mason never expected. He crouched down to Ava's level. His expensive suit crinkled slightly as he rested his forearms on his knees. He studied her face, his eyes searching, as if memorizing every detail. "My name is Benjamin," he said carefully. "I knew your mother." Ava tilted her head. "You knew Mommy?" Mason felt something break inside of him. Benjamin hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly. "Yes," he said finally. "Very well." Ava seemed to think about this, her little brows furrowing. "Are you my grandpa?" she asked, her voice full of innocent curiosity. Mason's stomach twisted violently. Benjamin inhaled sharply. For the first time, the CEO of Holloway Enterprises looked completely unguarded. Vulnerable. And in that moment, Mason saw it, the crack in the armor. This wasn't just about control for Benjamin. This was guilt. Regret. Pain. Mason could see it, clear as day, in the way Benjamin looked at Ava. The man wasn't just trying to claim some business advantage or exert power over Mason's life. He was seeing his daughter, the daughter he had lost, all over again. In Ava. And it was breaking him. A father's decision. Mason's throat was dry, his emotions tangled into knots. He could fight this. He should fight this. But as he looked down at Ava, at her wide, trusting eyes, he realized something terrifying. If Benjamin was telling the truth. If Camila had left him not because she wanted to. Then everything Mason had believed for the past 6 years had been a lie. And if that was the case, Ava had a right to know where she came from. But could he risk it? Could he really trust Benjamin Holloway? Mason took a slow, steady breath. And then, finally, he made his decision. His next words would change everything. He looked Benjamin square in the eye. And said, "A father's gamble." Mason had never felt this level of exhaustion, not the kind that came from scrubbing floors for hours, but the kind that seeped into his soul, weighing him down like an anchor. Benjamin Holloway stood before him, a man of undeniable power, a man who once shattered Mason's life without a second thought. And now, he was demanding the truth. Demanding proof. Ava, unaware of the storm raging around her, clung to Mason's leg, her small fingers gripping his worn uniform. "Are you my grandpa?" The innocent question hung in the air like a thundercloud about to burst. Mason's gut twisted. He could feel the weight of Benjamin's gaze on him, pressing, searching, demanding. Mason knew he had a choice to make. He could refuse. Walk out of here and never look back. Protect Ava from whatever storm Benjamin was about to bring into their lives. Or he could finally confront the truth that had haunted him for 6 years. A truth he might not be ready for. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. Fine. He swallowed, his jaw tightening. You want a DNA test? You'll get one. Benjamin barely reacted, but something in his eyes shifted. Satisfaction? Relief? Mason couldn't tell. But, Mason continued, his tone sharp as steel, I have conditions. Benjamin's lips pressed into a thin line. You're in no position to make demands. Mason let out a hollow laugh. You think I don't know that? You think I don't know that one phone call from you could have an army of lawyers at my doorstep? He took a step closer, his fists clenched. But if you try to take her away from me, I will fight you with everything I have. Benjamin studied him for a long moment. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he gave a slow nod. I don't want to take her from you, he said. I just want to know the truth. Mason didn't believe him. Not yet. But he had no other choice. Ava looked up at him, her eyes wide and trusting. And Mason prayed he hadn't just made a mistake that would destroy them both. The test that changed everything. The next 48 hours were hell. Mason barely slept. Every second felt like a ticking time bomb, counting down to the moment that would determine the course of his and Ava's life. At the clinic, Ava had clung to his hand while a nurse gently swabbed the inside of her cheek. She hadn't complained, just giggled, thinking it was some kind of game. Mason had forced himself to smile, to pretend that his whole world wasn't on the verge of collapsing. Benjamin had taken his own test in silence. He had barely looked at Mason. They didn't exchange a word. And now, they were waiting. The weight of the impending results felt unbearable. Mason sat at the kitchen table in his tiny apartment, his hands gripping a cold cup of coffee. The place was silent. Ava had fallen asleep hours ago, curled up in the small bed they shared. His phone sat on the table, face down, taunting him. At any moment, the results would come in. At any moment, his life could change forever. His knee bounced anxiously. He had spent the past 6 years believing Ava was his and his alone. But what if the test confirmed it? And worse, what if it didn't? What if Ava wasn't his daughter by blood? Would she stop being his? Would Benjamin Holloway try to take her away? Mason rubbed his hands down his face, taking a shaky breath. He didn't know how long he sat there, staring at the phone, trapped in the worst kind of anticipation. But then... Ding! The notification lit up the screen. Mason's heart stopped. This was it. With trembling hands, he picked up the phone and opened the message. And then... everything inside him shattered. The shocking truth. Mason had been prepared for 2 possibilities. 1, the test would confirm what he already knew, Ava was his daughter, and this nightmare would finally end. 2, the test would say otherwise. That he had spent 6 years raising a little girl who wasn't biologically his. That he had been living a lie. But neither of those things happened. Instead, the results revealed something even more devastating. Ava was Benjamin Holloway's granddaughter. But Mason wasn't her biological father. The name listed under father wasn't his. Mason's breath hitched as he stared at the name on the screen. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But the test didn't lie. Ava's real father was someone Mason had never even met. His stomach twisted violently. His hands went numb. His vision blurred as the reality crashed down on him like a tidal wave. Camila had been hiding something from him. She had been pregnant with another man's child the entire time. And she never told him. Mason's entire world tilted off its axis. Ava wasn't his. Not by blood. Not biologically. And yet. She was sleeping in the next room, safe, warm, his. She had called him daddy for 6 years. She was his entire life. Mason's breath came ragged, his mind spiraling. What was he supposed to do? Would Benjamin use this to take her away? Would he even have the right to stop him now? The thought of losing Ava was like being stabbed in the heart. He couldn't let it happen. He wouldn't let it happen. A sudden, sharp knock at the door yanked Mason from his daze. His stomach dropped. Somehow, he already knew who it was. Moving as if in a dream, he stood and walked toward the door. His fingers hesitated on the knob. Then, with a deep breath, he pulled it open. Benjamin Holloway stood there, his expression unreadable. And in that moment, Mason knew. Everything was about to change. A father's fight. Mason stood frozen in the doorway, his breath trapped in his chest. Benjamin Holloway stared back at him, his face unreadable, his piercing blue eyes holding something Mason couldn't quite name. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper. Something, conflicted. Mason's grip tightened around the doorframe. His mind was still reeling from the DNA results. Ava wasn't his. Not biologically. Not by blood. And yet. She was his daughter. He had raised her. Cared for her. Loved her in a way no DNA test could ever quantify. And now, Benjamin Holloway stood at his doorstep, the weight of the truth between them like a loaded gun waiting to go off. Mason's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. You got what you wanted. Benjamin's gaze flickered. Did I? Mason let out a bitter laugh. Didn't you? He stepped forward, his fists clenched. Ava isn't mine, right? So what now, Benjamin? You take her from me? You throw your money at some fancy legal team and erase me from her life? His voice cracked. Because I swear to God, if you try. I'm not here to take her. Mason faltered. What? Benjamin exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. For the first time, the powerful CEO looked tired. I don't want to take her, he repeated, softer this time. Mason's pulse pounded. Then why the hell are you here? Benjamin hesitated. And then. I wanted to see the man who raised my granddaughter. Silence. Mason blinked, his mind struggling to process the words. Benjamin continued, his voice steady. I spent the last 48 hours thinking about what I'd do when I got the results. If Ava had been yours, I would have walked away. His gaze darkened. But she's not. And I can't ignore that. Mason's stomach churned. So what? You want to claim her now? His voice was laced with bitterness. You weren't there when Camila died. You weren't there when I was working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over her head. You weren't there when she woke up crying at night, asking for her mother. His hands shook. But I was. I was there. Every single day. Benjamin's expression didn't waver. And that's exactly why I'm not taking her from you. Mason froze. What? Benjamin's jaw tightened. You're right. I wasn't there. I didn't even know she existed. His voice grew heavy. But you did. And despite everything, you raised her. You gave her a life. A home. Love. Mason's throat burned. Benjamin continued. I won't take that from her. He exhaled, his shoulders dropping slightly. But I want to be in her life. Mason's heart pounded. And if I say no? Benjamin's eyes met his. Then I'll walk away. The words shocked Mason more than they should have. Benjamin Holloway was a man who never walked away from anything. And yet. Here he was, offering Mason the choice. Giving him control over Ava's future. Mason turned his head slightly, glancing at the small bedroom where Ava slept peacefully, unaware of the war being waged over her. This wasn't just about him. This was about her. Could he deny her the chance to know her family? Could he live with himself if he did? A lump formed in his throat. After a long moment, he spoke. "You're not just some rich man to her, Benjamin." His voice was rough with emotion. "If you want to be in her life, you need to be more than a name. More than a check." His eyes burned. "You need to show up." Benjamin's lips pressed together. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I will." Mason studied him, searching for any sign of deceit. He found none. Finally, he stepped back, opening the door wider. Benjamin hesitated. Then, with a quiet breath, he stepped inside. For the first time in 6 years, Mason and Benjamin weren't standing on opposite sides of a war. They were standing together. And for Ava, that changed everything. A new beginning. Mason watched as Benjamin stepped into the tiny apartment, his expensive shoes sinking slightly into the worn-out carpet. The contrast was almost laughable, one of the richest men in the city standing in a place so modest that the walls still bore the crayon marks of a playful 5-year-old. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Benjamin's eyes landed on something. A framed picture sitting on a small shelf near the kitchen. It was of Camila. She was holding Ava as a newborn, smiling down at her with a love so pure it almost hurt to look at. Mason felt his throat tighten. Benjamin moved closer, his fingers brushing the edge of the frame. His jaw clenched, his shoulders stiff. "She had your eyes," Mason murmured before he could stop himself. Benjamin swallowed. "She used to say she had my stubbornness, too." Mason let out a small chuckle. "That's probably true." Benjamin took a deep breath. "I missed so much." His voice was softer now. Regretful. "I never got to say goodbye. Never got to apologize." His grip on the frame tightened. "She hated me." Mason didn't respond right away. After a moment, he exhaled. "She didn't hate you." He looked at Benjamin seriously. "She wanted to hate you. But she never really did." Benjamin let out a bitter laugh. "Then why did she leave?" Mason hesitated. "Because she didn't want to live in your shadow. She wanted a life she built, not one you built for her." Benjamin sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "And in doing that, she kept my granddaughter from me." Mason tensed. "She didn't keep her from you. She just, never told you." Benjamin looked at him sharply. "And you think that's better?" Mason didn't answer. Because honestly, he didn't know. Ava's awakening. A soft yawn broke the tension. Both men turned. Ava stood in the doorway of the bedroom, her messy curls falling over her face. She rubbed her eyes sleepily before blinking at them. Her gaze landed on Benjamin. And then, "You're still here," she mumbled, her voice laced with drowsy curiosity. Benjamin hesitated, then nodded. "I am." Ava tilted her head. "Why?" Mason felt his chest tighten. Benjamin crouched down slightly, meeting her eyes. "Because I want to get to know you, Ava." Ava blinked. Then, with a sleepy smile, she toddled over and plopped herself onto Mason's lap. She wrapped her small arms around his neck, her tiny fingers curling into his shirt. "You already know me," she mumbled against his chest. "I'm Ava. I like pink. And dinosaurs." Mason let out a soft chuckle, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Benjamin smiled, an expression so rare on his face that Mason barely recognized him for a moment. "Well," Benjamin said, "then I'd love to hear more about dinosaurs." Ava perked up immediately. "Really?" Benjamin nodded. "Really. Ava turned to Mason, eyes wide with excitement. Can we tell him about the T-Rex? Mason hesitated. This was a moment he never expected to face. The thought of Benjamin being in Ava's life, sitting here like this, listening to her, wanting to know her. It felt foreign. But it also felt right. He met Benjamin's gaze. And slowly, Mason nodded. Yeah, baby, he murmured. Let's tell him about the T-Rex. Ava beamed. And just like that, a new beginning was born. 6 months later. The change was slow. Gradual. But it happened. Benjamin became a part of Ava's life, not as some powerful CEO, not as a man trying to make up for the past. But as her grandfather. And surprisingly, he was good at it. He showed up. For school events. For birthday parties. For Saturday morning breakfasts where Ava would insist on eating pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. At first, Mason had kept his guard up. He had spent years being the only person Ava relied on. He wasn't ready to share that. But Benjamin didn't try to take his place. Instead, he fit into their lives in a way Mason never expected. And as time passed, Mason realized something. He wasn't losing Ava. He was gaining something, too. Because for the first time in a long time, he didn't have to do it all alone. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing. The final choice. One evening, after Ava had fallen asleep, Mason found himself sitting across from Benjamin in the tiny apartment, the glow of the kitchen light casting soft shadows on the walls. Benjamin placed a thick envelope on the table. Mason frowned. What's this? An opportunity. Mason hesitated before picking it up. Inside was a job offer. A real job. Not as a janitor. Not as some faceless worker in a corporate machine. It was an operations position. With a real salary. Real benefits. A real future. Mason swallowed. Why are you doing this? Benjamin leaned back in his chair. Because you deserve more than this, Mason. He gestured around the small apartment. You've spent years breaking your back to raise my granddaughter. The least I can do is give you a chance to build something better for both of you. Mason clenched his jaw. I don't want charity. Benjamin smirked. Good. Because this isn't charity. It's an offer. Mason stared down at the papers, his heart pounding. For so long, he had done everything alone. But maybe. Just maybe. He didn't have to anymore. Slowly, he exhaled. And then. He reached for a pen. As he signed his name at the bottom, something inside him shifted. This wasn't just a job. This wasn't just about Benjamin. This was a new beginning. For him. For Ava. For the family he never thought he'd have. And for the first time in years. Mason finally believed that things were going to be okay.